It is time for another of our popular In the News segments, and I am joined once again by Mr. Jim Cornette. Jim, welcome back to the Super Podcast.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be presenting these pressing news stories to the assembled minions of Brian Last.
Well, you are the anchor of this news program, so let's get started right away with the headlines. Our first story comes from Kansas City, Kansas, and the date is April 19th, 1935.
Kansas City, Kansas, UP. 5,000 wrestling fans angered a decision that gave a wrestler called the Big Bad Wolf a decision over Farmer Tobin of Humboldt, Iowa, rioted at Memorial Hall tonight. They broke windows, shattered chairs, set fire to the box office, and divided part of the gate receipts amongst themselves. Obviously, Bob Geigel was not present. Riot squads and the fire department were called. The Big Bad Wolf, a 225-pound mauler who also likes to be called the Great Unknown, precipitated the furor when on the final bout of a 2-out-of-3 falls match, he sneaked up on Tobin and waylaid him before the bell starting the bout had been sounded. Tobin, caught unprepared, was knocked out, and the referee held up the Big Bad Wolf's paw as the winner. The crowd of about 5,000 howled. A few of the bolder ones began breaking up their chairs, and the remainder soon joined in the fun. The fans pushed the box office through a door out into the street. They set fire to it, and 2 ticket sellers frantically sought to escape from the box office. They finally did. Meantime, the night's gate receipts were scattered along the way, and there was a free-for-all for the coins. Promoters estimated about $700 in losses.
We've heard of riots. You've talked a lot about riots you've experienced in Mid-South, but usually those were fans wanting to get a hold of the heels, in your case, the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette. Rarely was it they turn around and break their seats, storm the box office, set fire to it, and start dividing the money amongst themselves. Have you ever heard of anything like this?
No, and not with, I've heard of setting the seats on fire. But I have not actually heard of not only setting the seats on fire, but throwing the box office out in the street and taking the gate money. This could possibly be unprecedented in the history of wrestling.
Have there ever been occurrences you know of fans storming the box office?
Yeah, usually in the old days, it was either if some main event star like Jimmy Valiant missed Memphis and was not going to appear, or they were storming the box office to get the advance tickets, but never just, we're going to knock this motherfucker over because we're pissed.
What does the promoter say to the venue the next morning?
Probably, I'm sorry. I'll never run a wrestling show here again. I don't really know how you would make up for that. The box office out into the street.
And the wrestler, the Big Bad Wolf, also known as the Great Unknown.
Yes. And I hope that they have the FBI tracking him down under both those names.
This is 1936, the Big Bad Wolf. I mean, that was a big hit at the time, actually, in popular culture with Disney's cartoon, The Three Little Pigs.
Well, yeah, and also because it was the Depression, so the wolf was at every door.
And Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf was actually a hit song, which probably surprises a lot of people to hear. So,
well, no, who's gonna be surprised at that? Everybody's heard that fucking song. It was a huge hit.
Everyone's heard that song, but I think there are certain songs.
Big Bad Wolf, the Big Bad Wolf, the Big Bad Wolf. Who's afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?
Well, now I'm going to have to pay Disney for you singing that song here on the air. But no, I think a lot of songs like that, people are surprised were actually big pop hits. Like, when first time I heard Who's That Doggy in the Window, I never thought like, wow, people are actually running out and buying this record.
Oh my God, no. Those things sold like fucking hotcakes, even better than hotcakes.
They certainly did. And let's now go all the way to Mexico City, Mexico, May 1st, 1952.
In Mexico City, a spectator at an 8-in-the-ring wrestling match who climbed into the ring on a bet was carried out unconscious.
Very simple, to the point story. How many times do you think that's happened throughout the years, especially in Mexico City?
Well, I wonder if he won the bet or lost the bet. It would depend on how the bet was worded. I dare you to get in the ring, then I guess he won it, but get in the ring and do something to somebody, I have a feeling he probably came out on the short end of.
You're drunk. You bet with your friends. Get in the ring during a match is one thing. Get in the ring during an 8-in-the-ring match. Either a tag match or a battle royal, we don't know. That doesn't seem like a very good idea.
Well, maybe he thought he'd get lost in the crowd.
Let's now go to Nashville, Tennessee, a very historical article from June 13th, 1957.
Wrestling promoter Nick Goulas announced last night that he has bought out the mat interest of promoter Les Wolf in Memphis, who had operated in the Bluff City since 1948. We paid better than $32,000 for the franchise, Goulas said. Partners with Goulas in the move are Roy Welch and Mickey Barnes, with the latter as matchmaker at Memphis. The new owners will continue Wolf's Monday night shows in the City Auditorium. The purchase now gives Goulas' organization control of wrestling in the 5 major cities of Tennessee, including Jackson, as well as in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Mobile in Alabama, Jackson, Mississippi, and a number of smaller cities. We have sufficient wrestling talent to furnish high-caliber programs for all these cities and many more, Goulas said. He and Welch are affiliated with the Wrestling Alliance, which draws wrestlers from many countries. Well, I think that was the National Wrestling Alliance, which I'm surprised Nick Goulas did not have the NWA logo tattooed on his dick.
Well,
he had that everywhere. He loved that. Was so why it was so heartbreaking in a way when the NWA just walked off and left him when Jarrett split off and went on his own.
Well, you've said that to me in the past, that there was no promoter who said the words NWA or had the NWA logo on their TV as much as Nick Goulas.
Oh, no, but at the same time, the NWA champion usually didn't want to work there because he'd get stiffed on the payoff, or Nick was just such a miserable old fart there toward the end. But he had been promoting Nashville since 1938. And all of a sudden in 1977, 40 years later, all the ill will that he had drummed up came back to fucking haunt him finally.
Now, it says here that in 1957, he bought out Les Wolf for $32,000, which in 2017 money is close to $280,000. What do you think of that figure?
Well, I believe it. I would believe it, except who knows whether Roy Welch just said, sitting up here in Dyersburg, said, fucking, Wolf's got this fucking town on its ass and I'm going to take it over. And they forced him out, but that could have happened. It did in those days. But legitimately, wrestling took in, when you think about 52 shows a year, and even at the time, even though business was down, they saw what it could do. And I'm sure they saw that they could replicate the success they had in Nashville and in Birmingham and Chattanooga and et cetera. And Memphis ended up being a town that even before the Mid-South Coliseum, from the late 50s on, when Sputnik Monroe and Billy Wicks popped it, if they did 5,000, people in the Ellis Auditorium, that was probably considered an average crowd through the 60s. So that's 250,000 tickets a year at a couple of bucks even on average back in those days. So it was a $500,000 a year town. So I can believe that kind of money.
And of course, this is June of 57. It's not that long until they really popped the territory with Sputnik Monroe and Billy Wicks.
Yeah, which was several things happened at the same time. They got TV on in Memphis with Lance Russell, and Sputnik Monroe came in and Billy Wicks got over his hometown babyface. And when you think about it, by 1959, the summer, they were running outdoor shows at the ballpark because they couldn't get the people in the Ellis Auditorium. 10,000 people and 13,000 people in Memphis more than 50 years ago. So they were definitely making some fucking money.
For someone who was so responsible for that hot period of time, because he was in the mix, it really is interesting the career that Billy Wicks had, or I should say maybe didn't have, because he chose to really just walk away from full-time wrestling not that long after that.
Yeah, well, he saw that working for the city, he had a pension and benefits and things. And he was tired of getting screwed over because unless you wanted to be a Jackie Fargo or a Jerry Lawler or somebody who was going to stay in Memphis and be the straw that stirred the drink, as Ric Flair would say, and had that aspiration, you weren't going to be able to put up with Nick and Roy and all the promotional shenanigans and things and such that you would have had to put up with. So I don't think Billy Wicks wanted to be that.
Looking at just a period of time you were around wrestling as a fan and later in the business, so you can't pick Ed Strangler Lewis or anyone. Is there anyone more than Nick Goulas that you wish you would have at least met once?
Eddie Graham, just to say that I did and that, I would have loved to have worked for him. But yeah, that's the one thing I'm jealous of Bolin. He worked for Nick Goulas and I didn't.
He also got ripped off by Nick Goulas and you didn't.
Well, but and also he just happened to be standing in line next to him at the fucking Circuit City Electronics store in Nashville in 1987.
Well, let's now go to September 1st, 1962, Bakersfield, California.
And in this one, ladies and gentlemen, from San Francisco, the Shire Brothers, a professional wrestling team, were accused in a $50,000 damage suit filed yesterday of having leaped from the ring in North Vernon, Indiana, to assault a paid spectator with a chair and their feet. The spectator, Clint Williams, gave no explanation for their alleged conduct in the complaint filed in U.S. District Court. He said he suffered numerous injuries, including head injuries, which caused him severe and continual headaches. The suit was filed here because the defendants, Roy Shire and Ray Stevens, live in the San Francisco area. And this was right after Barnett got Shire fixed up with the TV in San Francisco, and he brought Ray Stevens out to be his top guy. And I'm sure that probably them having a lawsuit from North Vernon, Indiana, the home of Jerome Croney, by the way, them having a lawsuit probably made it easier, at least for Roy Shire, to convince Ray Stevens to leave town. North Vernon is about 50, 60 miles north of Louisville here, but that's when they were all working out of Barnett's Indianapolis office. And $50,000 would be what? It'd probably be about $400,000 these days.
It would be a lot. You know a little bit about this, don't you, where a fan causes something, gets hit, and then says he has no idea what caused.
These two guys just at this spot show, working with two good friends of theirs in a tag team match, just suddenly, and for no obvious reason, both leaped out of the ring at the same time and began pummeling this motherfucker in the front row. There's never any reason for it. It just happens suddenly, and I don't know what to say.
For no reason at all, they assaulted him with a chair and their feet.
Yes, that's what every time. That's exactly what they say. I don't know. I was standing there taking pictures, and suddenly,
it's happened to you several times, hasn't it?
Yes, several times, where I would just go and assault someone for absolutely no reason.
Let's now go to Los Angeles, California, April 12th, 1962.
Mrs. Sherry Gorge.
Gorge?
Sherry Gorge. All right, take two. Mrs. Sherry George, 37. That's easy for me to say. Filed suit Tuesday for a divorce from wrestler Gorgeous George, 47, charging him with behavior somewhat less than gorgeous. He threatened her life, she said. The trial is pending.
You know, I don't know if there's anything as sad as the last couple of years of Gorgeous George's life. And this is from April 62. By December of 63, it's December 26, 63, that Gorgeous George dies, penniless, living in Los Angeles. And for someone who was so responsible for the popularity of wrestling when television first hit the market, he was one of the people said they wanted to buy TVs to see Milton Berle and Gorgeous George. For him to die and for him to have those last few years of just being an alcoholic and having issues with the law, it's really sad, isn't it?
And 49 years old, too, I think, when he died. And, of course, they've written a great book, and one of these days they'll do a movie. Hopefully it won't be WWE Studios that does it, so it'll be good. But anyway, you know what? After reading the book, I kind of understand, why it happened that way. He didn't ever feel comfortable with it. And it seemed like that, at the same time as he was the biggest star in wrestling. But then again, there were places he didn't get over. He got over in Hollywood like crazy. The time they tried him in Madison Square Garden was a big flop. He headlined the first show back at the Garden after an 11-year absence in 1949, right when the TV had started, and he flopped. It drew like 4,000 people or whatever. But for the most part, not only people watching wrestling, but people knowing that a lot of people were watching wrestling. If you mentioned the word wrestling or professional wrestling in that period of time, everybody thought of Gorgeous George, just like Hulk Hogan. He wasn't necessarily it was the gimmick and the marketing, maybe more than the in-ring. But I think, overall, he was only on top as a really main event star for like 6 years until the network TV was 6-7 years and network TV went away. And then he never really, to me, it didn't look like he worked much of the territories after that. He just tried to take shots based on his name. And, pretty much that was it.
Yeah, one of the saddest pictures I think I've ever seen was the one of Gorgeous George losing his hair in the ring in Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah.
it's depressing seeing him. You know, he looks so aged and just losing his hair. It's very sad. And when it comes to the Garden, you know, it's after Gorgeous George and that failure where they really hit on the recipe for the future success for next couple generations, which was an ethnic babyface.
The ethnic babyface. First Rocca, and then Bruno, and Pedro, and it worked for 30 years.
Yeah. Well, let's now move ahead to Somerville, Massachusetts, November 25th, 1956.
Blonde 15 protests enforced wrestling. An attractive 15-year-old blonde, daughter of professional woman wrestler slave girl Moolah, told police today her mother forced her to wrestle professionally but didn't pay her. A neglect warrant was issued for the mother, Mrs. Lillian Pine, after Mary Carroll told police she was forced to wrestle despite a recent appendectomy. She showed police letters from 2 physicians advising her against future bouts. Lieutenant Thomas J. O'Brien quoted Mary, known in the ring as something, and Pat Sherry, I can't read that name, but she actually was most known as Pat Sherry, as saying her mother hasn't supported her for 3 months. O'Brien said the girl had appeared on bills with her mother and stepfather in Newton, Attleboro, Springfield, and Boston. He said Mary has been licensed to wrestle in Maryland and North Carolina. And that's the story that Moolah, and what was the date on this? 1956.
Yeah.
Moolah had trained her daughter so that they could go around and wrestle as the whole match, the package. And Moolah was taking the money, which showed flashes of her business MO in future days. If she'd take her daughter's money and force her to wrestle after an appendectomy, she'd probably take the other girl's money too. But that was, yes, I don't think Pat Sherry had a long career after that.
How about the fact she was licensed to wrestle at 15?
Well, yeah, because in North Carolina, that's South Carolina at that time, I don't think had a commission, but North Carolina, they live right down there. And Maryland, I'm sure Moolah knew somebody because that's where she won the women's tournament, which was actually that year, and became the champion. She was starting to get her hold on women's wrestling booking and getting herself over at that point.
You know, that's one of the really interesting things you learn about when you look into Louisville wrestling history, because it all kind of collides there. Was Mildred
Earl?
Mildred Burke was the biggest female wrestling star. And of course, her husband, Billy Wolf, was the promoter of all the women. And that kind of is how Moolah gets in the door. And then Moolah basically steals their entire business model and uses it for the rest of her life.
Yeah, it just when they split up, Billy Wolf and Mildred Burke, that left a big hole. And Mildred Burke had complained to the NWA that she was supposed to be the one that was continuing on the business. And they had said they were going to honor that, but they all wanted to do business with Billy Wolf because he was a guy. And so I think the rest of the NWA promoters said, it's going to be nothing but trouble. We need to get away from all these people. And Moolah was right there at that time to pick up a lot of slack.
What do you think about the whole stranglehold that Moolah had for so many years? I know like people like Debbie Combs and Cora Combs were on the outside, so they never really got in with that. But for the most part, Moolah controlled women's wrestling forever, especially with Vince McMahon Sr. and then Vince McMahon Jr. You hear a lot of different things. You hear things that she was a nice lady, but then to some of the women that worked for her, she wasn't so nice, that it was almost like slave labor at times.
Well, it's all true. She was nothing but the delight of a Southern gentlewoman and blossom to me. Anytime I talked to her, she was nice and courteous and everything, and just loved everybody and just had the impeccable manners. And she also screwed a bunch of those girls out of a bunch of money. So, I mean, you can't not say it. And, you know, and just but I mean, like you mentioned Cora Combs, especially in Tennessee, Mildred Burke had been a huge star. Nick and Roy loved to use her. And Cora Combs, because she was from Eastern Kentucky, she was local and she was gorgeous in her day. Of course, that was in the late 40s, early 50s. But they were big stars, the women wrestlers. And so Cora Combs managed to put a foothold in the Tennessee territory that Moolah couldn't do anything about, but Moolah could pretty much control whether you got over or didn't get over, or you got used or you didn't get used for most of the territories for probably 25 years.
Well, let's now move ahead to Columbus, Ohio, your old stomping grounds. April 24th, 1936.
Shikout's counsel says Grappler was told to lay down. charges that a wrestling trust exists in the eastern half of America and that grapplers are forced to win, lose, or draw according to orders or lose huge forfeits whirled through federal court today. The charges were hurled by defense counsel as Joe Alvarez, Boston matchmaker for promoter Paul Bowser, sought an accounting of the earnings of Dick Schickat, claimant of the world's heavyweight title. Alvarez said he had a contract as Schickat's manager, but that the latter repudiated it after taking the crown from Dano O'Mahony in New York March 2nd. Schickat's attorney, John Connor, asserted Schickat was forced to put up a forfeit to prove he would obey orders and that in the match with O'Mahony was ordered to lay down. A temporary restraining order banning Schickat from the ring until the case is settled was dissolved by federal judge Mel G. Underwood. Alvarez's plea includes a request for a temporary injunction.
Well, there it is.
Well, there you have it.
1936. I mean, everyone always blames Jack Pfeffer for exposing the business, but it's starting right here. You see the wrestling trusting quotes. And of course, there really was a wrestling trust.
Yes.
Nothing to be quoted. And Dick Schickat's a major wrestling star. The fact that he's going to court over this is pretty interesting.
Well, and basically, Schickat's attorney is saying that Schickat was told to lose the New York match that he took the crown in. So it appears that basically the defense counsel, Joe Alvarez, who was the matchmaker for Paul Bowser, is obviously on Paul Bowser's side in getting an accounting of the earnings of Schickat, and he said he had a contract and a deal with him as the manager. Apparently, did Schickat double-cross O'Mahony, and fucking Paul Bowser looks bad, and so his matchmaker or booker is trying to get in Schickat's business. It's that's bad business all the way around, as they used to say. Bad business.
And, we talked a little bit on the drive-thru recently, Jim, about the origins of some of the expressions people use in wrestling, like doing the job. And here you see in quotes, and obviously it came from the actual courtroom, was that Schickat was ordered to, quote, lay down, which is something you still hear today. So here it is, 1936. He was told to lay down, and he had to prove that he would obey orders.
Yeah, well, or if it was boxing, take a dive. Everybody's got their terminology. So, yeah, and once again, in those days, this was few and far between that people that far up the food chain in wrestling would be airing their dirty laundry in newspapers and in lawsuits and et cetera. That's why it was usually settled with a tire iron over the head rather than getting in court, because you got newspaper articles like this. But, once again, it was confined to specific instances or specific territories or whatever, and it would hurt, but business elsewhere, maybe they hadn't heard about it. It wouldn't hurt business too much. It's never been a situation where it is now of stuff happens and instantly the news is everywhere. Everywhere.
And it makes me also think about some of the other lawsuits that would happen in wrestling where people would go out of their way to not expose the business. Like when Ron Fuller sued Ronnie Garvin for the boat.
Yeah.
And, how did he win the boat? He won the match. Well, if the match was on the up and up, he keeps the boat. And Ron Fuller wouldn't say it was a work and he lost his boat.
Yeah. Yeah, they quit having so many Cadillac and boat tournaments then, because every time one of the Fullers would buy a Cadillac or a boat or a Lincoln or whatever, they'd have a tournament for it. Going back to, I think, their father, Buddy Fuller, and Roy Welch even loved to do stuff like that. And after that, they quit putting the boats and the cars up in the tournaments so much.
Let's stay in the courtroom, but let's go to Des Moines, Iowa, January 26, 1962.
Wrestler Myers awarded verdict. Harold C. Sonny Myers, a wrestler from St. Joseph, Missouri, won $150,000 yesterday in the retrial of his federal suit against P.L. Pinky George, former Des Moines promoter and the National Wrestling Alliance. A jury in U.S. District Court deliberated 4 hours before returning the verdict for Myers, who charged that George and the Alliance conspired to keep him from top-flight matches. The suit, under the antitrust laws, was tried before federal judge Roy L. Stevenson. Holy shit, how much is $150,000 in 1962 worth today?
$150,000 in 1962 is $1.2 million in 2017.
Well, I've heard from people who saw him that said Sonny Myers was a great wrestler and a wonderful worker, but I don't think he would have earned $1.2 million in his wrestling career as a wrestler or promoter if they'd have spotted him the one and he just had to work on the two. So but this was at a time where the antitrust laws suits had sunk in, and the alliance was nervous, and everybody was nervous about that, and things were happening.
It wasn't the end of Sonny Myers and the NWA either, which is interesting.
Well, but it was, I guess, and Pinky George was one of the old timers. Sonny Myers was the next generation. He ended up getting in with Bulldog Bob Brown and Bob Geigel and those guys. And, he never went anywhere besides the Central States.
I believe they would end up running Iowa.
Yeah, well, that was really the pretty much the Central States territory. It was Iowa and the state of Kansas, and Missouri if they, crossed the river into spot shows around there or whatever. But that was pretty much the Central States territory.
And for our last story this week, we have a letter to the newspaper. I will read the letter. Jim, I'll let you give the editor's response. It's from the Detroit Free Press, April 27th, 1979. Jim Rolfelson from Detroit says, "Have you ever attended big-time wrestling bouts? Are these fights on the up and up? If these fights aren't fake, Howard Cosell doesn't wear a rug."
Well, Jim, show me a guy who doesn't believe wrestling, and I'll show you a skeptic who says there are no flying saucers or Martians either. Anyway, it's not the match, but the sideshow that counts. Best fight I ever saw was at a Dick the Bruiser blowout. Hundreds swarmed down the aisles after that animal. One old doll swung a purse, then a chair at a cop, and he knocked her 10 rows. Somehow she wound up with his nightstick and came back beating on his head. I loved it.
And that is professional wrestling, folks. So wait, an old woman swung her purse and then a chair at a cop, not at Dick the Bruiser, at the cop.
Well, I guarantee the cop was keeping her from doing it to Dick the Bruiser, because then they'd get mad at the cops. Oh, I've seen them attack the cops on numerous instances, and old women think they can get away with anything. In Lubbock, Texas, one Sunday afternoon for World Class Wrestling, I look over at the front row. And we're working with the Fantastics, and we're getting the heat on them, and people are mad. And this old woman is shaking her fist at me, and she gets up, and she picks up, and in the building they were using at the time, they were those plastic chairs, not folding chairs, but plastic chairs that don't fold up. You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
So she gets that by the back of it, and she picks it up over her head. And it's light plastic, but still, it's a struggle for her. And she starts walking toward me, and I said, this woman is coming over here at like 1 mile an hour, and she's going to hit me with that chair. What the fuck do I do? And she's literally doddering and holding that chair over her head, and she's still walking, but it's like literally 5 steps or 5 seconds for every step. And finally, I said, I can't hit her. I'm just going to block it. So as she goes to hit me over the head with this chair, I just reached up and grabbed a hold of it so that it wouldn't hit me. And that much effort threw this old woman's balance off, and down she goes.
Oh, my God.
And now it looks like that, basically to people in the far end of the building, that I've blocked this chair and whacked this old woman in the chair with it, or in the head with it, and she's gone down. And now people start getting up and picking up chairs. And I roll in the ring, and the cops are trying to get this woman up, and she's still shaking her fist at me as they're trying to pull her back to her seat. Almost started a riot.
It's not just old women, though. I've seen old men in wrestling shows. They're the ones who are usually ready to yell and scream and throw something and maybe even take a punch at someone.
Oh, and they were the ones that was most likely to pull out a fucking pocket knife, too. The older, the worse. The older they got, the worse off you were. If they start reaching in their pocket, kick them in the nuts or poke them in the eyes as fast as you can.
I just imagine sitting in the upper deck, like I assume this editor here was, and you see the old woman get hit 10 rows back by the cop, and then somehow she got his nightstick and came back and started beating him over the head with it. I mean, that's amazing.
We had a dust-up in the Midnight Express match in Tulsa at the Downtown Assembly Center that they ran most of the time. And so the city police force decided that they were going to enforce an old statute on the books that they weren't allowed to work security at the wrestling matches because there was too many lawsuits, too much trouble. Because they had internal affairs come down and investigate when the cops had nightsticked these people that were trying to kill me, et cetera, et cetera. So the very first show where the county sheriff's department works security in Tulsa is a show at the Fairgrounds Coliseum in Tulsa, which is the security was even worse, and it was harder to keep them under control, and it was a different layout. And Tulsa was always bad anyway. So we're the main event. In the match before ours, Nikolai Volkov, the 285-pound giant Russian, is going to go out and work with Terry Taylor, right? And they sent the old sheriff's deputies. They looked like they were all on like retirement duty, 65 years old or older or whatever. And I'm like, these guys are our new security. They go out with Nikolai, and seconds later, two of these deputies come dragging the oldest, the third deputy. One of the fans had tried to hit Nikolai over the head with a chair on his way to the ring, and he had missed because the cop got in the way to try to block it, and he had horse-collared and knocked out the fucking sheriff's deputy, who they were dragging back unconscious now. I said, oh, great, we're next. They're killing the fucking cops. What are they going to do to me? And it was fucking brutal. And from then on, they sent the youngest deputies that they had and the biggest ones and twice as many of them.
Well, with that, Jim, it's another episode of In the News, in the books. Do you have a sign-off for this news program?
Good night, and have a pleasant tomorrow.